All right, welcome back to the Jiu Jitsu Mindset. My name is Pete Deely, and I'm here with my professor, Professor Lucas Hubo. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning, Pete. How are you doing, brother?
I'm good. You're not quite as handsome as you were last week, though, Professor. I hate to say it. I and I
I think every day that when I wake up, I look at you and I think you're doing better, man. Every
I
single
think
day. Every
well,
single day.
I would say that it's your choice. Last week you had on a t-shirt. That t-shirt really made your look sing.
True,
But
true.
I don't see a Jiu-Jitsu mindset t-shirt on this morning. So just
So
for your
um,
future, just so you know.
yesterday I was like exposing the Jiu-Jitsu t-shirt, the Jiu-Jitsu mindset t-shirt in the world, and now he's watching, so
Now
that's
it's
why.
being washed clean. Well, just as well. We don't want to smell your
The
dirty
weather is changing also. We might need to do like some hoodies and jackets,
Oh,
something
hey.
like
All right, you're probably right. Yeah, I am kind
that.
of cold right now. Um, so we have had just a string of extraordinary luck in the people who we've gotten connected with, and
Absolutely.
we are yet again very lucky. And we have a gentleman named Aaron Jannetti, he has a lot of different things to bring to this conversation. He's got skills in a variety of areas, and his life's like many of ours, but he's got a life full of lots of different things. Everybody makes sure we acknowledge the fact that we're parents and he's a father, but in jiu-jitsu, he's a brown belt, three-stripe brown belt. He's a business owner. He's a self-defense instructor. He's got courses that address, dealing with knives, dealing with firearms, which for us, we've had like, Professor Todd Fox was on there, and we talked a
Yeah.
lot about, the violence in terms of things that he trains for. And we had John Rankin, who had been both, military, trained military special forces in addition to being an MMA fighter. So, I think one of the things we'll learn about today is the ways in which people train when they and change when they train in circumstances that are uh, lethally, potentially lethally violent. So,
Yes.
Aaron, thanks for making time for us today. We're really glad to have you here.
Honored to be here. I'm looking forward to the talk.
So along that sort of that introduction, maybe what we could start with is a description of the different ways in which you teach self-defense, and maybe different ways in which you've observed people change based on what you're teaching them, because you teach in a variety of modalities, and I'm guessing that people react differently when you're training them in jiu-jitsu. You're training them with knives, training with firearms. Those are probably different experiences that probably have different outcomes. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime you get into fighting, which is with all of these arts, anytime they come together, there's a chance to pull and bring up things for different people in different positions. So, one of the things that we discussed a little bit briefly before we hit record here was, Pete, for you, you haven't shot a firearm before. So there's a lot of people that are going to be in that same boat. And that in and of itself, based off preconceived notions, things maybe they heard from their family or friends growing up, or just what they've seen in movies, they might have an idea
Yeah.
of how scary those things are, right? So
Uh-huh.
the gun for somebody might be a pretty intense trigger. Just the idea of being around one, not
Right.
even it might not even be loaded. We're not even shooting it, but the thought of it may bring anxiety up.
Hmm.
Obviously, if you've taken any sense of time to think about somebody stabbing you, the thought and reality around being a knife can be very consuming.
Yeah.
But even a person that has actually come from a situation maybe of domestic abuse or
Yeah.
sexual violence, even just let's just say we're playing guard,
Hmm.
and that could bring back and elicit very intense emotions on the same exact
Yeah.
level as somebody terrified of a knife or a firearm, things like that. So
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
to your point, different modalities of teaching different topics can bring up and elicit different responses out of different people, right?
Yeah,
It's
Uh-huh.
sure.
all pieces and variables and things coming into it. So I think as a coach, no matter whether you're teaching kickboxing, you're teaching a jujitsu, you're teaching Krav Maga, karate, anything
Right.
in those realms, you have to to be a good coach, in my opinion, you have to have your finger on the pulse of that at any moment in time, I could be triggering a response in some form or fashion. And that I should know how to introduce these topics in a very digestible, palatable manner for a lot of different people. But also have at least some resources or some go-to concepts around how do I approach and address somebody that does have a response in some form or fashion.
Yeah, sort of a trigger.
Yeah, so to bring that full circle, let's take something like a firearm, right? There's a massive difference. I say this loosely. There's obviously a massive difference in I'm out with my family at some point in time, and then we encounter somebody with a firearm, as far as what that's going to be. Then I'm going to a training session. It's an open mat on Sundays, at our facility here in Columbus, and I might get choked out by a higher belt or even a lower belt that gets, the better of me, that type stuff, right? So we know while drinking coffee, having a conversation, that there's a massive difference between the two of those. The body, for the most part, really in moments in time, like stress is stress.
Yeah.
So if I'm getting hunting down by a, I'm 37, I'm not quite over the 40 mark yet, Pete. So I don't know if I can wear that one shirt, but if I'm getting hunted down by a, insanely athletic 20-year-old purple belt, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like just trying to do this, I'm stressed and my body is feeling stress, right? And if somebody pulls a gun on me, it's a different type of stress.
Yes.
It is stress.
Right.
And that's a really important piece of the puzzle. So from a self-defense perspective, the more that I can get people in those positions of stress, and again, in a palatable manner, in a safe manner, slowly introducing them to what those things are, the higher the likelihood, it's never a guarantee, we know this, the higher the likelihood that they can temper that stress to a reasonable level and then make the best decisions, right? And, we talk about fighting and self-defense in general. A huge part of it is decision making. Right. Even on the highest levels, you can watch, ADCCs at the top level, IBJJF at the top level, and you can see I can have two fighters that are relatively the same level of skill, athleticism, all that type stuff. However, the way they managed the stress of competition, the way they managed, whatever their livelihood was up until that point, and then the decisions they make in moments in time, where do I put this grip? How am I moving? How am I addressing those responses? That becomes a big piece of the puzzle. To make good decisions, we generally have to have been put in those similar positions enough times to even know what the decisions are to be made there.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many great things about what you just said, and like that very last thing, I think of Hicks and Gracie saying educated instincts, that you educate your body to react in there. And we're not the only one to use this term, but I would say the thesis statement of the jiu-jitsu mindset is being comfortable while you're uncomfortable. And Professor Todd Fox uses that expression, stress inoculation, which I like as well. And that seems to be, along the lines of what you're talking about. Go ahead, Professor.
So for you, Aaron, as a coach, right, how you develop those your students' skill levels in self-defense, right? Because I did jiu-jitsu, right? So, and then you can have the ranks, so you can have type of classes that a certain group of people will be attending as a fundamentals classes, advanced classes, competition, whatever, women's class, whatever it is, right? How is that, if it has any type of separation, right? And type of techniques that you will teach for someone that is barely starting, your curriculum in a self-defense, compared to someone that's been training for much longer. And of course, like law enforcement, right? Changing goals, I believe, also going to change the way how you will deal with each one. But how is that structure a little bit that you use it?
Yeah, great question. It's similar. Anytime you're going to teach in a group setting, for the most part, the structure of I got to learn these building blocks before I can understand these ones, and then these ones before I can understand these. That's very common. For us, I know there are some organizations in the jiu-jitsu community that have very specific curriculum for white belt, blue belt, purple belt, all the way up. And then, another subsect of jiu-jitsu is when you're ready based off, whatever the professor thinks in that regard. You can play both of those, I think, in any martial art. For us, specifically in self-defense, we look at it as, well, before I can do anything, before we can even talk about defending against a knife, I've got to understand verbalization and how do I even just present myself, show confident posture, making eye contact. I've got to understand, basic balance and footwork. I've got to start putting some little miniature building blocks. So how do I develop power to throw, whether it's a punch or an elbow or a hammer fist? How do I start to understand the mechanics of, what's inside control on the body versus working outside of the elbows and the different theories and that and level changes. So for us, we have had the most success at our facility here in Columbus with a level system, very system to belt, or very similar to belt ranking, just no belts. Well, I take that back. We still use the term black belt once you've competed through it, because if I go out into space and I say I'm a black belt in whatever program, there's a general assumption that, oh, that guy at least knows a decent amount about what he's talking about.
Right.
So for us, to give you an idea, we have a set curriculum. And we actually stole the design of the poster that we use for our lesson plan from a gentleman by the name of Ryan Hoover. Very, very talented. He's a BJJ black belt. He's done a bunch of Thai boxing, but he's been in the Krav Maga world for a very long time. But it's essentially a circle, and it's like this subset leads to this subset, which then allows you to access this subset. And so we have a huge poster in our gym right when you walk in that literally shows you the path you're going to take to get to how do I survive a knife attack. So to give you an idea, we have fundamentals classes 3 days a week, and we're going to be expanding upon that. And in the fundamentals classes, there's 12 techniques, and they cover your basic stance, verbalization, footwork, basic striking concepts, initial stand-up wrestling, a little more geared around Greco-Roman because in the earlier phases, we want them to learn to stay standing. We know fights go to the ground quite often, and we go very quickly into the ground. However, if I can stay standing, I would like to stay standing. That gives me opportunities to run and all that type of stuff. Especially as a father with my family, I would prefer to not have to tussle on the floor, lose visualization of where they're at, right? So we do basic stand-up wrestling mechanics. So your arm drags and pummeling concepts, very, very briefly, very low level. And then we introduce 1 or 2 chokes and grabs. But again, it's let's just get them moving. Let's get some foundational pieces. Those are 30-minute classes, very low intensity, and it's just geared towards let's lay a foundation of what are we even talking about here? Where are you at physically? Then they graduate out of those classes. We usually require a minimum of 10 of those before they can graduate into a full class. And then if they need a couple more, they stay a couple more. But then they go into our level 1. And so we do level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5. It's the same as white, blue, purple, brown, black. It's all the same as far as that goes.
Awesome.
The
And then those build.
Yeah, Professor Lucas has used, I think, this expression at times where like the professor, the teacher has to, teach the way the student learns rather than like the student learn the way the professor teaches. And it sounds like, you have do you come from a law enforcement, military background, or a particularly spicy youth of violence and
now you're talking my language.
Is that because I will tell you, like, guns for a variety of reasons haven't been a part of my life, but I've had 2 times in my life when someone has threatened me with a knife, and that was an interesting experience. That I'm just curious in terms of you finding your way into what you're doing. Was there a moment in time or was there a reason that like you gravitated to this, or was it just intellectual curiosity that then led you to become an expert? Like, well, how does this start?
Let me ask you this. Can you give me a quick synopsis on one of those events if you're okay with that?
Yeah, I can. And I mean, and almost nobody knows this story. So this is
now at least 16,000 people will know.
Yeah, this is that kind of slipped out without the possible consequences that I have to talk about it. I'll tell you the one that was the most disturbing to me. I spent some time as I'm 8 years old and I'm living in like a Navy. I'm in San Diego and I'm in with these group of kids, and there's a rough group of people in my area, and I always have thought of myself as like a scrappy kid. I was never like particularly I wasn't easily intimidated, but I was certainly not like a kid interested in conflict. And I had my baby sister with me. She's 3 years old, and we're in with a bunch of kids, and some of them are older. And they start to like intimidate us, and they want my sister to say something. And I push my sister behind me and I say, leave my sister alone. And the guy says, if she doesn't answer my question, and he takes out a knife, he said, I'm going to cut your sister. And so I'm in between my 3-year-old sister and this kid who is only probably 12. I mean,
Yeah.
you're talking about children. And we just left. Like, we just we just physically got away, and it wasn't like a pursuit. I'm not sure that the kid really was interested in doing anything but posturing.
Yeah.
But it was a uncomfortable situation that stayed with me forever.
Yeah.
And I certainly recognize how it could have gone. And I didn't have any illusions even at 8 that we only got one choice. Like, we got to get out of this situation. But anyway, that was my, that's the story I'm willing to talk about.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's big. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. And again, at 8, if you look back, and this is sidebarring a little bit, but this is a mindset podcast. If you look back and you understand, anybody who's looked into like long-term trauma and things that happen and where you're most impressionable, 0 to 7, teetering on that 8-year-old mark, that's where a lot of our habits and tendencies are developed inside of that range. And that's very close into that range. Right. And we always have to have a delineated number of like, oh, it's 0 to 7, but I mean, it creeps in that space.
Yeah.
So that's intense. Well, thank you for sharing that. That's huge. And it's interesting. You said 2 things in there that stick out to me. One, that you were a scrappy kid, but you weren't looking to fight, but you weren't necessarily intimidated. I'm almost on that same boat. I was I wasn't going to initiate any fighting when I was a kid, but I kind of in the back of my mind wanted other people to. Like, that was kind of, there. But that's
and just to round that out, just so that way I said, like, we moved a lot, and I was new. I was skinny, and I had a New York accent. So every time I got into a new situation, we were from New York, we went west. Every time I got to a new school, people like, I was athletic, but I wasn't like a big muscular kid. And someone would come to like be the bully. And I learned that if I just smashed that bully out of the gate, then I never had the rest of people would leave me alone.
It's like going to prison, right? You got to find the first guy and get him whoop into shape. At least let him know you're worth it.
Out in the yard, those boys get rough.
It's interesting. That one stuck out to me because from a personality standpoint, I completely relate to that. And I really think that's an important place from a mindset standpoint. I think that's an important place for all of us to be. You shouldn't want any issues. In fact, we should do everything we can. I think a lot of people, back to one of the questions you asked earlier, like a lot of people pursue self-defense, jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, whatever it is, because they need an outlet for whatever stress they've got going on. But 2, in the back of our mind, we're not sure what would happen to us if something bad happened. And that can creep on a lot of people. Some people are blissfully ignorant. But anyway, where I'm going with that is I think that's where most people should be. You shouldn't want any trouble. And I think the more you're around training, you realize you don't want any trouble, like, because it can go bad like that. You know what I mean? So you have a huge respect for that, and you're willing to bring whatever you need to the table if in fact it does go. And I think that's such a powerful mentality to have, where, at least growing up for me, so I was born in 86, so like the tail end of the 80s, early 90s, and it was always, the aggressor was the bad guy, and so you had that mindset. It was like you either were a pacifist or you were, I don't know if I'm allowed to swear, but an asshole.
Yeah, right.
And there was no in between. And unfortunately, that kind of sunk its teeth into a lot of people. And so it's, well, I'm not a violent person. It's like, I get that.
Right.
But I've got a wife, I've got a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old, and you better believe the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to talk my way out of this and leave, and don't go stupid places with stupid people to do stupid things and all that kind of fun stuff. However, there's a switch where I can channel my Youngstown childhood and I will do some absolutely terrifying things to a human if I needed to. And I need that. Like that's me being a father. I think that's such an important piece. And to play off of that in the opposite realm, you talked about that kid, like he's most likely posturing with a knife. I don't think he really had any chance to go into that. There's a different mindset these days, especially, it seems, again, at least in my experience, there's a different mindset where like there was an era where if we had a problem, we could just scuffle it out and then everybody
Yeah.
went their separate ways.
Yeah.
And I think the more removed you are from fighting, you lose that respect of what can actually be positively developed out of a physical altercation.
Consequence, right?
Yeah. But then there's also a displacement from reality, like you were saying. I don't think that kid realized, even if he did get what he wanted and he
Right.
did cut you,
Right.
the long-term effect of doing that, like for him psychologically, for you psychologically,
Oh,
legally
yeah.
and financially for his parents, and what that looks like in the long run of things. And there's a huge, like with social media and the lack of physical interaction, face-to-face type stuff, complete avoidance of any conflict or confrontation.
Right.
And now you have like we can't have that anymore. I'm not saying we should all be running around fighting each other. I mean, I kind of am, but there's that huge disconnect in like what is a basic physical altercation to resolve a conflict versus you were mean to me, I'm going to escalate to shooting you or stabbing you. And that to me is, there's a fascinating mindset that goes with that too.
I mean,
I agree. Yeah, 100%. I feel like the kids nowadays, and they don't have that sense of consequence that something can happen and they can just fight, and again, not being pro fight on the streets or nothing
Yeah,
like
be real
that.
touchy
But,
with that, yeah.
but like they don't know what can happen. So they never have like that fear and, like you said, sense of respect by someone saying that this can go bad, they can go fight. No, this is not happening anymore, right? It's never like one against one anymore. It's a
Yes,
10 against one, or other things that just escalate so much. And I believe this carries so much on who they are later on in their life, right? Because they
Yeah.
never passed through those experiences.
Yeah,
Well,
it's huge. And I got in way more fights before I trained than
yes,
after I
yes,
trained. And I
yeah,
get that
Oh,
question a
100%.
lot,
Yeah.
yeah.
100%.
especially from younger kids, like, oh, I bet you, beat the crap out of people and stuff. It's like, honestly, man, like since I started training and really started to understand the consequences of it, and plus I get it all out of my system. But like I avoid it like the plague. I'll be the first guy that if somebody's probably, hey, I am so sorry. Like, let me buy you a drink. What can I do
Yeah,
for you? Like,
right, right.
because I don't want any part of it. And the more you're around it, you start to realize like there's a time and a place to
Yeah,
deal with these things and to put it. But you get removed of that. And yes, there's some intense alpha egos in training, and they're going to attract that
You can
effect
have the
too. But
confidence on walk away because
yeah.
what
Oh
you
my
do.
gosh. That's a beautiful way to
That's
put it. The confidence to
that's
walk away, which is
something
huge.
huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
and I don't like there's circumstances, ages. There's like this lies on a continuum, right? I will tell you that I benefited from being punched in the face. Like, and what I
Absolutely.
mean by that is that when somebody punched me in the face, I realized that if you punch me in the face, I don't die.
Yeah.
Like it was a useful thing early in my life where I got into just a regular fight. Like I got punched, and it taught me that that it won't kill me. I've had a
Yeah.
couple of situations where I got like thrashed pretty good that was a little worse than that, but in a certain sense, like that didn't kill me either.
Yeah.
So I think that there's something that you guys are saying there. I do think that as you go along in age, that of course, like the most dangerous people on the planet are, young men, because they're physically capable and they don't appreciate, the consequences. Like that 12-year-old, no sense of consequence. And,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and the hormonal cocktail that's in it. I mean,
right.
as again, without pushing any weird triggering buttons, but like just we're kind of chaos machines as kids, like boys. Like we have to get out and grab and tussle and wrestle and screw stuff up and
I
figure that
agree with
out.
that. And so, we've talked on this show of people fighting in the MMA. We've talked about people, training in the special forces and being in the special forces. To me, these are all like escalations of violence that, depending on the circumstance, the one thing as an adult that was interesting to me is that as I have been around a couple of violent situations, there was a time that I recognized that, oh, a schoolyard scuffle is different than two 25-year-olds, in the parking lot of a bar. And, you can find yourself in a homicidal situation on either side
Very
of the
quickly.
equation. And then, now things are really bad. I am curious about this, and I'm going to be careful because we could sprawl into lots of things, that the disposition of everybody that goes through, do they land in the same spot? And here's what I mean by that. Does everybody come out more confident than they went in? And I'll give you, since this is Pete Deely's therapy session, I'll give you another moment for me.
Yeah.
Even in my 50s, there is a part.
You're 50?
I'm 53.
Good for you. Okay, you look good. I hope I look that good at 50, brother.
I thought I said you were 50. I thought you were 60.
Yeah, Professor Lucas tells me all the time that I look terrific for 75. He's like, you look like magnificent if you were just 25 years old. He also tells me I'm the ideal weight for a guy 6'7", and I'm only 5'9". So, but
Anyway.
even at this decrepit old age, there was really a sense before training jiu-jitsu that if something happened, I was not going to lose the fight. Like, I think I carried that. And then in my first 6 months, I'm rolling with one of our coaches, this coach, Brett, and he has me, and I realize that that I can't do anything. Like, Brett is going to do with me, Coach Brett was going to do with me whatever he decided. And like, there's no, oh, if I get angry here, all of a sudden I'm going to turn into the Hulk and do something. Like, I had never felt quite so helpless.
Yeah.
Physically.
Vulnerable.
I was vulnerable in a way that my body had never quite. Like, it's one thing if I had been, people had come and surprised me in a group of people and all the rest of it. Like, psychologically, I could work my way around, like, well, if it was a one-on-one situation, that wouldn't have happened.
You're
So
rationalizing.
I come, yes, right. So my jiu-jitsu experience is one that I think right-sized my relationship to risk in the world. So I have a sense of the type of danger that I could be in that I didn't fully appreciate until, I've had these experiences where I've recognized, like, I would be totally helpless if the people around me really wanted to hurt me. I would not be able to defend that. So that's a long introduction to this, the question of does everybody come out with the same things, or do people come out with different things? And does some of it look like tempering overconfidence, and does some of it, Professor Lucas likes to say, jiu-jitsu will sometimes bring forth a more aggressive tendency in somebody who's meeker, and then maybe somebody who's over assertive, it might temper them down to be a little, calmer, or
balance, right?
Yeah, a little more balance. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. It's a phenomenal question. My answer to that is, in the right hands, everybody has the potential to find that balance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's to me, that's a really important distinction, because we have a tendency, no matter what the discussion is, we have a tendency to place specific answers on the pedestal of the art.
Okay.
So the idea that jiu-jitsu will make you confident.
Mm-hmm.
That's okay. But realistically, jiu-jitsu is not making them confident. Whoever their community is that they roll with, the coaches they're working with, the atmosphere that they're placed in, how is that journey mediated by those that are in charge? That's what's making them confident, not the art of jiu-jitsu, because you could pick them up and put them in a jiu-jitsu gym that is, or I should say a jiu-jitsu program that's inside of maybe a primarily MMA gym.
Yeah.
And now their experience and exposure to jiu-jitsu is 20-year-olds that are prepping for an MMA fight that don't know how to temper and manage that.
Yeah.
And maybe the management or the head coach also isn't necessarily concerned about the longevity of whatever from business or standpoint. So,
Right.
and that's no different in self-defense. And we see this all the time. You see arguments all the time from different sectors, which is like, what art is better for A, B, C, or D? Is it jiu-jitsu or is it Krav Maga? You know, what's better for self-defense? Is it jiu-jitsu or Krav Maga? What's better for self-confidence? This or this? And they're missing the point. It's in my experience, it is less about the art. It is more about the individual variables that are going to take place wherever they're training and how they're exposed to it. And then you're mixing that with whatever their variables are. So to those, those ladies and gentlemen that maybe have that more aggressive temperament initially, they may do very well at that MMA gym that's a little rougher and humbles them, kind of knocks them down a peg, because now they're getting teed off on, but they have the youth, the longevity, the athleticism to manage that. That's how I came up. So earlier you asked, like, how did I find whatever the heck I found here? Shorter version of that, because I think this is a really good topic to continue to discuss on. I was in college. I was a pissed off, angry kid, former abusive alcoholic father. My mother raised us, like that very common story with that. But I was leaning towards aggression. I never started fights, but I wanted them. And I did pretty well to that point with the fights I was in. But anyway, I had to drop out of Ohio State for a quarter. I'm in Columbus, Ohio. So I was at Ohio State. I had to drop out for a quarter because I was paying my way through college and I just ran out of money. So I'm like, just broke up with a girlfriend. My grandfather passed away, who was a huge father figure for me. I'm already an angry, lost kid. And I was either going to fight people in the street or I didn't know this at the time, but I found an outlet, which at the time was a Krav Maga gym. And that's how I got introduced to it. And as I was learning jiu-jitsu and I was learning kickboxing and I was learning Krav Maga, I was great at picking up on, go fight this big guy. You know nothing about it. And I'm going to learn to keep my hands up because this dude's bloodying my face. Keep your hands up. Like, but that is not how 99% of the world's population learns, right? So taking it back to the conversation that we were discussing, maybe that's what they need. That's the environment they need. They need taper down for a little bit. I would argue that environment is not going to serve them into their 30s, 40s, and 50s. But maybe as a young 20-year-old, they need a dose of reality. And maybe that dose of reality is a couple of pretty ragged MMA fighters that are going to, crank a little harder on some things, maybe not breaking it, but making you feel pretty bad about yourself. Now, on the other end of that spectrum, I have, let's say a 40-year-old that's got 3 kids, has a very good profession, like their life is set, but they're looking for something else. They've been maybe talking themselves into jiu-jitsu for a decade and they're finally taking their first step into the gym. That person does not need 20-year-old MMA fighters beating the shit out of him. What he needs is somebody that recognizes jiu-jitsu is going to be a hobby for this gentleman. It's going to serve him well. It's a hobby for this gentleman. And I need to realize that the other 98% of his life is always going to be more important than what happens on the mats. So I need to make sure that if he's going to be here consistently, I am mediating the experience so that the time he is on the mats is the best possible experience on the mats for him as possible, so that he keeps wanting to come back, even though all these other responsibilities are going to call for him. Right. And so it's less the art. Your question, like, does everybody come out of this more confident or balanced or whatever?
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
It's less, in my experience, it's less the art and it's more who is delivering, who is the one that is presenting, creating the atmosphere, creating the situation that goes into it. And that then has the highest potential for somebody to get all of the benefits of whatever the art is.
Yeah. I love it, Aaron. That was such an awesome way to explain things. And I believe 100%, I'm a great believer on that, on our one of our goals as an instructor, professor, coach, whatever it is to provide the best experience for the students, right? When everyone that is coming to your class, they're coming for different reasons. They're different people with different experience and willing to have different intensity levels on the mat, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was the beginning, right? So the beginning on that 20 years old, we should be sensitive enough to understand that that's the way how that person will learn compared to the other 4 years old of the life set, and that's the way that we're gonna learn. But at the end, it kind of blends, right?
Yeah.
It's like they understand why they're there and how they need to do things. And it seems like is that idea on like passing to the next one, to the new student now, those guys now they're going to start doing the same, hopefully for the new students that are coming in, and they will help identify how those new students are learning, and it blends and it starts to become like that generation of like a good culture on your gym, on your jiu-jitsu school and everything, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the other things that, along these same lines, I gave two extreme examples, right? We to call myself out on this as far as it goes, we have a tendency especially in the US, we have a tendency in life in general this day and age where like we only ever pay attention to the polars, right? Like, I mean, think about politics. We're only paying attention to the most extreme on the left and the most extreme on the right, where 97% of the population is like, hey man, I just want to make a living, take care of my guy. Like, I'm not even, the squeaky wheels are getting the grease, right? And that can happen in a lot of conversations. So those are polar opposites: the 20-year-old kid that needs put in his place and the 40-year-old dude that's financially wealthy and all that. But in the middle, there's all this gradient that comes into it. And, like I said, a good coach should be able to identify those things and manage them and taper them, and be able to meet the student where they're at to a certain degree. There's a difference, like you were asking earlier about like rank and filing for lesson plans and things like that. Well, if I'm doing one-on-ones, that goes out the window, because if it's a personal training session, I can just curate exactly what you need in any moment in time, right? So that's neither here nor there. But I should be able to identify where each student's at, help them in the early phases along the path, and then to your point, Professor, show them how to then curate their experience. Hey, listen, maybe you shouldn't be rolling with these three guys, and you know that, and that's okay. And we all agree we're just on different wavelengths, but you could still be in the same class and do this. So I should be able to coach them into that point. But as a coach, I should have the ability eventually, as a great coach. So let's go another level. So good coach, great coach. As a great coach, I should have the ability to curate both ends of the spectrum and everything in between. And the example that I would give is, well, let's say I do have a pretty competent fighter, right? And I do need to put him through some paces. If he's going to go up into some high level competition, he needs to know there's a massive difference in, rolling over a bunch of white and blue belts in open mat and making yourself feel good about it, and what it's going to feel like at your first ADCC trial when everybody's hunting for a spot in the big show. You know what I mean? And it's a different pressure, and they don't care about you. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
A really great coach that still has the physical ability to do that, because at some point we are going to age out. Like when I'm 60 still coaching, I'm not going to be able to give a 20-year-old black belt a run for his money. I can give him wisdom, but I can't give him my body anymore at some point. But if I'm still in the spectrum where I can be pretty athletic in my endeavors, I should be able to show them high levels of controlled violence. And that's I talk about this a lot in self-defense, but there's a direct correlation between your skill level and your ability, your understanding of violence, and your ability to choose violence, right? Spazzy white belt isn't necessarily violent because they're choosing to be violent. They're violent because they don't know anything and they have no choice how to get out of this position but to freak out and be violent, right? But the more I understand violence and the more skilled I am, the more I get to choose my level of violence based off what I need. That's why when we do see skilled fighters out in the abyss dealing with self-defense situations, they're usually relatively uneventful situations, because what ends up happening, they end up controlling the person. And then you have a video of like Dean Lister sitting on somebody's chest, tapping him on the head, being like, bro, calm down, the fight's over. Yeah. He was able to do that because he's so talented in violence. Well, as a good coach, if I got a guy coming through the door, for instance, we have a Muay Thai fighter at our gym, and he was not trained by me. I'm a decent kickboxing coach. I am far from a really good Thai boxing coach. But he's a very talented fighter, and he was preparing for a fight. And so 1 or 2 sessions, like I'm still a rough kid that, you know, grew up in Youngstown and whatever. So I can go ham and I can take damage. And I can cardio tap almost anybody, at least for another 5 years. And so what he needs is pressure. And so in those cases, in that pressure, I might not be able to outskill him, but I will run you, I will march you down and just body shot the hell out of you. And I know how to hit you to hurt you, but not injure you. And but that takes talent and skill level, right? So that's the, you know, like my professor, Mike Cheney, incredible coach, incredible practitioner. He I don't know when he trains and how he gets as good as he does, because I swear I'm at the gym. I own the gym that he teaches out of. I'm there. And like he gets exponentially, like our growth patterns used to be like this. And then one day his growth pattern started doing this. And I was like, where'd you go? But anyway, he will run me ragged. Like I was prepping for a combat jiu-jitsu match last year. And I mean, it was bad.
So one of the slaps, if you get one.
Yeah, with the open palms, right? And I mean, it's just bad, like demoralizing. Like I had a moment that was like, do I know jujitsu? Like, what has the last 14 years been?
That's encouraging to hear that that still goes on even with you guys.
But he's hitting me, and he's hitting me hard, and he's rolling me up, and he's slamming submissions on, but he's doing all of it all the way up until injury, right? And so I think a great coach is able to monitor that spectrum, like which I think is such a beautiful way to put it, Professor, where you're saying for some people they need built confidence. For other people, we need to make them, you know, aggressive. For other people, we kind of need to knock them down a peg. And then we can meet in the middle where we're confident, humble, and aggressive at the right amount on either side of it. I think a good coach has the skill set to be able to curate all of those angles, not just one or the other, if they're going to really get some cool places, at least in my thought process.
You see 100%. That like played out in the last tournament that we had. I was talking to the professor, and we were talking about on the mats with the white belts up to the black belts. And I was using an analogy to soccer. It's like when I watched the white belts, I think of kids in a scrum on the soccer field, and everybody's like going all different ways. There's very little. And by the time I'm watching the black belts, it's like an elegant. The movements are very. They feel like slow until they're not. But you know, and you know, he was describing to me, you know, that the margin of error is so different at the black belt level, that this, you know, a small opening of change, and that so the pace, that spazziness up until like total control. And I think that analogy exists in all the different areas of the world. I mean, we're focused on, well, what might happen in a physical confrontation, but that same level of control exists at the business table, you know, in terms of being, you know, relaxed and calm and not creating. It exists in the family. It exists, all of those things, and being able to know what to do and what not to do. I do have a question about bias as it relates to being competent at, say, jiu-jitsu, firearms, or knives. In your circle of professionals who teach in those different ways, does somebody who is first an expert in firearms look at the person with the knife and go, don't bring a knife to a gunfight, and the knife person going, you know what, that jiu-jitsu is one thing, but you know, in the face of a knife, it's not. Like, is there a sense of like bias towards the most lethal tool or not? So could you talk a second about that?
That's a great question. I've actually had a lot of conversations about this exact topic as of recent. So it's good. It's a very poignant question.
Okay,
yes. And usually it's going to be whatever your initial background was, right? Or whatever you have the most exposure to. Now I float in the middle. I'm kind of this, you know, I'm friends with everybody. I love everything. So I enjoy training traditional Eastern martial arts whenever because there's a beauty to that, and there's a movement in that. You know, I'll be the first one to say I think 90% of it's BS, but there's a beauty to learning how to move my body in very specific ways that you're only going to learn there. You know, I would argue that a massive amount of what most people are going to learn in a jiu-jitsu setting is out of context of self-defense. And I think we can, for the most part, agree to that in a lot of cases, right? Because there's just so much to it. Firearms is the same exact way. There's a beauty to understanding how to control a thing and be very accurate with it and very fast. And you talk about on the higher levels, these tiny little nuances. Well, on the higher levels of, let's say, the sport of shooting, a hundredth of a second in your reload is the difference between you winning or losing a match. And like that to me is fascinating. So, you know, I float in all the circles. I train Kali, I train kickboxing, I train Muay Thai, I train Jiu Jitsu, I train, traditional wrestling, I train Krav Maga. I'll train with anybody I can. There's a gentleman at our gym that I've been trying to make time to actually train with, but he does like feudal Japanese samurai sword training, and I'm like watching it going like, man, there's some really cool stuff in here, like Aikido and some other things. But anyway, so any of those systems, we are more often than not, we will be biased towards the thing we know the best.
It makes sense.
So a jiu-jitsu fighter, when presented with a problem, is going to attempt to solve the problem more often than not through the answer of jiu-jitsu. A gentleman that maybe is a firearms guy, or even just grew up in the country and shot guns all the time, is most likely going to try to solve all the problems with a gun, and vice versa. And it comes from everywhere. And in my experience, we're all wrong.
Right.
I define self-defense. I define self-defense as the lens I view surviving violence through.
Yes.
A real life violence. And to me, that is the lens that I look through that lens with jiu-jitsu, with Krav Maga, with boxing, with firearms training. I don't think any of them are self-defense, in my opinion. I don't think jiu-jitsu is self-defense. I don't think Krav Maga is self-defense. And I started in Krav Maga. I don't think firearms training is self-defense. I don't think any of those are self-defense. I think they are all martial arts. They teach you skill sets and concepts and body awareness and rhythm and athleticism, and they give you tools. To me, self-defense is one metric. What is my context? If I'm a law enforcement officer, self-defense is first and foremost, yes, I have to enforce the law. I'm a peacekeeper. I'm supposed to be keeping things civil. I have to protect myself. I have to protect the people that are in the immediate vicinity. And there's a sincere element where I have to protect the person I'm attempting to control, right? That's a massively different context than I'm out with my wife and my 2 kids. My job is to protect them and them alone. If I'm out by myself, all I have to do is protect myself. So I say this loosely in quotes. I ran track in high school. I was on the team. I didn't really run very much, but I've got an amazing, I say amazing, I have a really good 400-meter sprint. So somebody pulls a knife on me and I'm on my own, my skill set for self-defense is to sprint 400 meters and juke and drive my way through public. If I'm with my wife and my kids don't run that fast. And my wife is 3 months post-op of an Achilles rupture. So now I have to use skill sets from, maybe I have my gun on me, maybe I have my knife, maybe I'm using my wrestling and my striking. So self-defense to me is a different component. So we are, in my opinion and experience, we are biased to the thing we know the best.
Yeah, that makes perfect.
Jiu-jitsu, gun guys try to solve with gun guys. And the problem with that is a lot of answers can be answered that way, or a lot of problems can be answered that way. And then there's a huge subsect of answers or questions that is the worst way you can answer them. Like I'm gonna rag on my gun guys now. I'm a fan of education around firearms. I think if you're competent and you put a lot of training in and you can be responsible and you understand your responsibility with firearm, then yes, absolutely. I think you should have the right to carry it around. I think you should train a shit ton. I think you should have the right to carry it around. But most people assume that, well, if somebody tries to attack me with a knife, I'm going to shoot them. But if you put me within 5 feet of you and I have yet to present the knife yet, and I get hands on you, you're not getting your gun out by the time I stab you 5, 10, 15 times if you have never once wrestled, grappled, done jiu-jitsu or judo. You have to have a skill set of open hand skills and practicality to be able to even access the tool you're talking about in a certain range. Well, then I have the opposite of that. If there's a situation where now I'm at distance and I maybe can use a firearm to defend myself, but I don't have access to that firearm, well, me running up on somebody with a knife from 20 feet away doesn't make a lot of sense when the knife doesn't do any damage from 20 feet away. So there's we talk about combatives. The way we look at the word combatives, at least in the circles that I float in, combatives is self-defense. If you're going to carry a weapon or deal against a weapon, I have to know how to shoot, what it takes to stab somebody, what it takes to strike somebody, what it takes to wrestle with somebody, what it takes to talk somebody down and de-escalate them, what it takes to maybe I can't de-escalate them, but to set myself up where they're not paying attention, and now I can hit first and knock them out and resolve the problem with a punch. And that to me is a more holistic version of
Yeah,
self-defense
yeah.
than where most
That's
people pull
awesome.
from.
That makes sense.
It's much more, right, Peter? It's much more than you think. As just like techniques, but it's
Yes.
actually a self-awareness.
So much.
Yes.
So
One,
much.
it's hard.
Crazy.
It's hard, and that's why a lot of people are less in tune to it, because it's not only hard to build all of those skill sets, but it is very rare to find a coach that can either give you enough of each bucket to help you as an individual, or have the resources to point you to go to do it. And it can get very expensive. Going to the range, if you were to take a decent self-defense shooting class, you're anywhere from $200 to $500 in just for the class. And then on top of that, with ammo prices the way they are right now, you're probably spending another $150 on ammo. And then you have to drive to the range, and then you're outdoor the whole entire time. And if it's summer, it sucks and it's
If you
hot.
got all the money in the world, I'll tell you right now, there's not enough time. Like I'm rushing out of a 75-minute class with Professor Hubo to get to, because I have a job and I need to, and I have a friend, childhood friend who I've known most of my life, and he has 3 different black belts, and we were, he's my age, and this is maybe 20 years ago. And all the kids are fascinated with the fact that he's got 3 black belts. And so the younger kids are like, well, what's your best move? Like, what's your, and he said, well, come over here. I'm going to show you my best move. And he brings all the kids and he puts them right in front of him. And he's like giving them the mean mugging, type of thing. He's like, okay, are you ready? And they're like, yeah. So you sure you're ready? And so he's giving them, and they're all like 7, 8-year-olds, right? And then he looks at him and he turns around and he runs, and he runs away from him, which was, I thought, like a lovely, lovely way to kind of not translate his, his martial skills into an attitude of that you should get into a fight. There's one thing about what you're saying that I'm going to just highlight here, because I feel like culturally this has been lost over many years, and that the notion of being a multidisciplined person is in my mind a very is a bloom of the warrior mindset. I think the warrior mindset has been translated into self-defense, when I don't believe that that's in. I think it's lost. And I will give you just a quick example of like something that I don't think many people would associate with like having a warrior mindset. When I started my beginnings of learning what martial arts I did as a kid, the notion of being able to calligraphy and poetry and the arts being a part of the training is something that attracted me as a kid to like trying to become a person that was very well-rounded and complete, but not just as a fighter, as a human being. We're coming up to the end here, and we always ask this question because the answers are just infinitely fascinating. And that is, can you tell a story of a student that you feel like was the most dramatic arc of change that you train? And I know you have lots of those stories, but could you pick one of we started this podcast. We want people to try jiu-jitsu, and we want people who start jiu-jitsu to stay in jiu-jitsu, because we feel like they don't get what it has if they quit in a year, and that they only get to, the language only develops once you learn your ABCs and your your words, and can build paragraphs and ultimately long stories. It doesn't have to be about a jiu-jitsu person, but could you tell a story of transformation?
Yeah. I mean, as you alluded to, I mean, gosh, I've been coaching for 15 years, so I have a lot of those. And I would venture to say there's some that I don't even know about. You know what I mean? As far as like impacts on people's lives that have come into it. One that sticks to mind, and I'll I'll do the classic, some names were changed to protect the but I'll give you a synopsis of one, and I think this is a super powerful one. We had a student that had a history of sexual abuse, and dealing with that led to alcoholism and drug use, right? And so, over the years, you have this very, very long standing trigger that keeps coming up, and through again being introduced to these arts. And at the time, it started off with Krav Maga, and then it went into Jiu Jitsu and kickboxing, and that's how we operate at the school. Is like, do everything, do whatever you want the most, but do everything. But anyway, the appropriate curation of these situations allowed that person to overcome standard triggers, like somebody putting hands near the throat, right, to get to a point where she can change the way what those triggers elicit.
Yeah.
Right. So able to change that. But I found this out much, much later in the journey on it, that it actually helped. And she's not the only one. I can actually think of one in even more recent history. But that it literally helped her kick the drugs that she was doing. And last I had checked, I haven't spoken with her in quite a while, but at the time, like a couple years ago, she wasn't drinking anymore. And that's cool. And I can now think of 2 or 3 others that were dealing with issues around alcoholism, that led into men and women. And to me, I mean, think about it. It's like, gosh, to live day to day with a historical situation that ate at you, and it ate at you so much that you started trying to taper it down and avoid it, or numb yourself, right, through a substance that then starts to pull you into an addiction cycle. And to be able to break out of that because you showed up for a self-defense class,
Yeah, right.
that to me is I mean, I could screw up a lot of stuff in my life, and that one would make you sit back and go like, damn, like that is such a cool impact. And there's so much power in that. But again, it comes from consistency over a long period of time. And for that to happen, that experience has got to be appropriate for that person, as we talked about several times. So
yeah, I will say that, like, when you were talking about, like, where does the confidence come? It comes from a school well run and designed to build a culture that supports and builds up people by understanding the person and then teaching to that person, rather than developing a culture that you force people into. And by doing that, I think you give the opportunity for people to have those transformative experiences. I will say that, like, in the beginning of my experience with Professor Lucas, is that one of the things that I was curious about, that I loved, is the way that he ran the kids classes. Because for me, most athletic things, most of all, as children, is really about character formation and his ability to kind of like create an environment in which the kids were both safe and allowed themselves to kind of learn, and that he never prioritized being good per se over learning over, we're here to develop hard work characteristics. School is important, all those other things. And as you build a culture that allows for people to experience something traumatic in a manner in which they can be safe, then I think it moves it. And Professor Todd Fox and I talked a little bit about, you move things from your lizard brain to your executive function. And Professor Drysdale on our talk with him talked about some of the same things, of people moving from drug addiction and alcohol and even ADHD medications and to me, yes, it's the movements, but it is first the disposition towards each other. And that safety, because tapping, Professor and I talked a lot about tapping, that's a unique experience, I think, to be put in danger, but to still have your partner be safe. Professor Lucas, I don't know if I'm going to be able to release this episode because I gave too much personal stuff about me in this thing, but we're come up on our time. Is there anything that you want to ask before we kind of start to move towards wrapping up?
Pedro, like always, right? We always have wish we could have another 14 hours, here with
Indeed.
Aaron. Aaron, such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And it's been a pleasure to meet you well, like you seem such a nice guy and a great energy. And I hope one day we can cross on a mat and train together. It'll be really fun. Really appreciate it,
I'd
man.
love
Yeah,
that. I'd
come
love
to
that.
Arizona. All
will
right,
be.
Aaron. Yeah, come on out. We'd love to see you at the school. You would really like to group. All right. Well, thank you very much, and we're going to talk to you another time.
Sure. Thank you.